So between their founding in 2019, Ferrari made well over 200,000 cars, but not all of them were created equal. Today we're going to be having a look at 4 of the more interesting and unusual cars they've made and have been forgotten by time. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to give it a thumbs up, let us know if we've missed anything in the comments, and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Now, we're all very familiar with the central driving position of the McLaren's F1 and Speedtail, but what if I told you Ferrari built a road car with the central driving position back in the late 60s? Well, say hello to the Ferrari 365P Berlinetta Tre Posti, or just the Tre Posti for short. The underpinnings of the car are actually really interesting. Ferrari was racing the P2 at the time, and the 275 P2 and 330 P2 were both run as works cars, which means they were raced by the factory themselves. What Ferrari then did was they built a version of the P2 to then sell to private racers called the 365 P2, which these guys could then go and take racing. What Ferrari did was they based the chassis largely on this 365 P2 and fitted it with a variation of the absolutely legendary Colombo V12, which, you know, it's up there with the Metzger Porsche engine or the Bizzarini V12 from Lamborghini. You know, some engines stand the test of time, and this is absolutely one of them. In this car, the engine was pretty much the top spec it came in. It was a 4.4 litre unit, it made 380 brake, and it sent the power to the rear wheels, so this thing was potent, to say the least. For the looks, you know, I think it's fair to say that anyone with a pair of working eyeballs can see a clear resemblance between the Tre Posti and the Dino, and I mean that's no mistake. You know, the fact is that the Dino Berlinetta Speciale, which was the kind of concept car for the Dino, was shown at the Paris Motor Show in October of 1965, and then the Tre Posti followed a year later, also at the Paris Motor Show. Now, Pininfarina designed both cars and obviously leaned heavily on this Dino design language when they were penning the Tre Posti. All in, Ferrari built 2 units. The first one was a white car, which was shown at the Paris Motor Show, and then the second was a metallic grey car. The white car went to Ferrari's North American distributor, a guy called Luigi Cinetti, and then the grey car went to the boss of Fiat at the time, Giovanni Agnelli. Personally, I love it. I think this is a real gem from the Ferrari back catalogue, but honestly, the next one is one of the coolest cars Ferrari have ever made, and maybe one of the coolest cars ever built. If you're watching this video, the chances are you can name the big 5 without even thinking. But once I point this detail out, you'll have a hard time not seeing it. If we think about the jump from F40 to F50, it makes complete sense, right? You know, the basic design is very similar, but you can tell that the F50 just saw more of the inside of a wind tunnel. If we go from F50 to Enzo, you know, it was a bigger jump, but a lot of the language of the design was quite sort of contiguous. It was shared. I mean, particularly if you look at the bonnets of the 2 cars, there's kind of a shared kind of element there. If we're going from Enzo to Ferrari, I mean, personally, I think that's kind of the clearest child of the car that came before it. Now, I don't care what you say, the jump from 288 to F40 was insane. They're 2 completely different cars, and it's almost as if there's a kind of missing link between the 2, and the reality is there is. In my mind anyway, this is kind of one of Ferrari's great forgotten cars, the 288 GTO Evoluzione. I mean, this car is as cool as they come. So I didn't know about this car for a long time, and I went to Heveningham Hall Concours, and we get there and there's this thing sitting there on the lawn, and I was just absolutely blown away. I mean, the fact is, this car was parked up next to the Harrods F1, and it made it look pedestrian. I mean, there's very few cars in the world that can do that. But anyway, this is another example of a car designed for Group B rally in the 80s. So we can count, you know, the Audi Quattro, Ford RS200, and the Lancia 037 amongst its contemporaries. But this thing was on a completely different level. Ferrari built 6 in total. 1 was kept by the factory, and then 5 were sold off. And it had a twin-turbo 2.9 litre engine that was clearly heavily based on the 288 power plant. It made 650 brake, and it only weighed 940 kilos. Now, I've been in a base 288 GTO a few times, and they are pretty leery. I can't even imagine what this thing must be like to drive. And actually, that makes me think. So there was I was reading an article by Classic Driver when I was doing the research for this, and the guy who's writing the article was fortunate enough to go for a passenger ride around the Nordschleife in one of these things, and he kind of, you know, he did the lap, and he got out and he turned to the guy who was driving and he went, you know, the power delivery is not very progressive, it's not that linear. And the driver turned around and just went, It's about as progressive as heavy artillery. You just point it and fire it. Now this car doesn't need much of an introduction. And in fact, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna let Jacques Lafitte bring this one in with his boat shoes. He's out there. No race suit, no race shoes, no helmet, no balaclava, nothing. He's just giving it absolute hell around whatever track that is. But listen, that thing, it sounds ridiculous. So, you know, a lot of you are gonna know the F40, but I don't think people grasp actually how hardcore that car is. I mean, it genuinely might be the most unhinged thing Ferrari has ever been associated with. In 1987, Ferrari celebrated their 40th anniversary by unleashing, by far and away, the least compromised and most focused car to date, which was the F40. And in fact, one of the 288 Evos that we were just talking about was actually used as a development mule for the F40 program. Now, 2 years went by, and then the French Ferrari importer, Charles Pozzi, ordered an even more focused version, which he wanted to field at Le Mans, which was very creatively named the F40 LM for Le Mans. Michelotto had, by this stage, established a bit of a talent for taking regular road-going Ferraris and turning them into some of the world's most furious race cars. For the uninitiated, go and have a look at the 333 SP, whose engine, by the way, ended up going into the F50, and then the yellow 365 Daytona that they built. These guys they're serious. So, your starting point is a car that will already light up its rear tyres in fourth on a hot summer's day. A car that has no interior and was engineered from the outset as a track-focused weapon that weighs only 1,400 kilos, and you want it to go faster. Fair enough. First things first, you're going to lose 330 kilos worth of stuff. I cannot for the life of me figure out where you're going to get that from, because the original had no carpets, no sound system, no door cards, no central locking, no electric windows, but you're going to find 330 kilos and get rid of it. Second step, we're going to take the engine, which, by the way, no one has ever accused of being underpowered, ever. And you're going to add 250 brake. We're going to replace the intercoolers, we're going to replace the cams, the engine management system's going to go, you're going to up the compression ratio, and then you'll pop in dual fuel injectors for every cylinder. Once that's done, you're then going to take the turbos, which initially produced 16 psi of boost, reinforce them, and then turn up the wick so that they produce an absurd 37.7 psi. To go along with your extra power, you're also going to need a fancy new racing gearbox without synchro, so that you can just slam through the gears. And then you're going to add vented brakes, triple plate clutch, new suspension, and then for the icing on the cake, we're going to go for some lightweight OZ wheels. Now this thing is an absolute animal. Not only is it a seriously cool car in and of itself, but the fact that they took something as Spartan as the F40 and turned it into something that manages to both be a surgical instrument and a sledgehammer at the same time is absolutely incredible. I like to think I'm a fairly enthusiastic Ferrari enthusiast, but I'll be honest, I only became aware of this car like, I don't know, 4 years ago, and sort of understood really how special it is. I was in a Ferrari garage in California, and I saw this old sun bleached poster of an F50 GT on the wall, what I thought some naff company like Gimbala had gone and ruined another car. And to be very clear, those 25 Carrera GTs did absolutely nothing to you, and they deserved far better than you gave them. But that's an entirely different story. Fortunately, that wasn't the case. This car was designed by our old friends Michelotto in conjunction with the absolutely legendary Dallara. Dallara are big boys. They've designed race cars for Formula One, IndyCar, and actually they're the exclusive manufacturers, I think, for Formula 2 and Formula 3. They've also had a hand in designing the KTM Crossbow, the Alpha 8 and 4C, a bunch of Ferraris, a bunch of Porsches, the MC12, and then most recently they've actually been involved in the production of the tubs of the Veyron and the Chiron. So pairing these guys with Michelotto is like getting Koenigsegg and Pagani to team up and build a car together. It's insane. Ferrari was running the F40 GTE in the BPR Global GT series, and when McLaren entered the F1 GTR, Ferrari decided it was time to show them what's what. The F50 had been designed from the outset outset to be the closest thing to a race car on the street. You know, it had a carbon tub, the engine and suspension bolted directly onto this tub, and then the engine was derived from the 333 SP power unit. But what did they actually do to the car? Well, in terms of the exterior, firstly, they got rid of the fixed spoiler at the back and then replaced it with an adjustable wing, which would be at home on a Cessna. They then installed the fixed roof, complete with a massive air scoop to feed the engine. The front air intakes were enlarged, a huge front splitter, a massive rear diffuser, and then the exhaust tips were centralized on the rear bumper. And while the exterior transformation was drastic, you know, it doesn't even touch how aggressive the drivetrain modifications were. Now, the information about exactly what was done is essentially non-existent, but what we do know is that the engine was developed from the same 4.7 V12 unit found in the F50. In the F50, it made 512 brake at 8,500 RPM, and that's seriously respectable. That car is famous for being like one of the great sounding cars of all time. The F50 GT revved to 10,500 RPM and made 750 brake. I mean, this revised powertrain was like absolutely biblical. So I mean, I think the best thing to do is have a listen to this thing pulling a dyno run. It's insane. So why is this thing not one of Ferrari's most famous and most successful race cars? And this is actually a really interesting story in and of itself. The BPR series was cancelled and replaced with the FIA GT Championship in '97. The hair in the soup for Ferrari was this. Mercedes unveiled the CLK GTR and Porsche unveiled the 911 GT1. Now, the F1 GTR and the F50 GT shared one key attribute, which was they started life as road cars and then were adapted for use on the track. The issue Ferrari had with the GTR and the GT1 was they were fundamentally designed to be race cars. You know, the engineers built the most uncompromised racing machine that they possibly could and then worked out what the bare minimum they could do to get this thing onto the road was. You know, no one has ever got in a GTR or a GT1 and go, God, this thing's a great GT car. You know, they're race cars. According to Ferrari, they had an inherent advantage over something like the F50 GT. And in fact, they felt so strongly about it, they actually said to the FIA that they wouldn't enter a race car if the GT1 and GTR were allowed to enter. Well, Ferrari were told where to shove it, and the F50 GT project died there and then. With one complete car built, 2 other cars in build, and then 3 unfinished chassis on the production line. Unfortunately, you know, again, this isn't confirmed because information is very, very few and far between, or bits of information are. The 3 unfinished chassis were allegedly destroyed. Chassis number 1 was sold to the American collector Art Zarifopoulou, I think is his name, I probably butchered that. But chassis 2 then went to the Japanese collector Yoshikuni Okamoto, and then chassis 3 ended up going to American collector Jim Spiro. Now, chassis 3 was sold to Australia around 2000 before being sold to, I think, probably the most serious car collector on the planet. And this was at some stage between 2000 and 2016. This car was seen on this person's Instagram a few years ago before they shut the Instagram down. And I actually found an insane video of this thing being driven around Yas Marina a few years ago. And if you look, you'll see that actually quite interestingly, the guys clearly modified it quite significantly. You can see that, for instance, it's got a paddle actuated gearbox. And, you know, I'm sure a bunch of other things were done to make it drivable, because it's not like they've got spare parts for this thing on the shelf, because there are 3 of them. So there you go. There are 4 of Ferrari's deepest cuts from their back catalogue. You know, just researching this has given me a bunch of ideas for other videos. You know, maybe we'll have a look at all the Ferrari one-off commissions that they've built, or do a series on homologation specials. In any case, thanks for watching. We'll see you on the next one.